you want a vision of the future, Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
Someone is trying to teach me a lesson in futility. Why am I the only one who wasn't killed?
They will run you dizzy. They will pile falsehood on top of falsehood until you can't tell a lie from the truth, and you won't even want to. That's how the powerful keep their power. Don't you read the papers?
I just want to say one word to you. Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
I'm gonna get your money for you. But if you don't get the President of the United States on that phone, you know what's gonna happen to you?
What?
You're gonna have to answer to the Coca-Cola Company.
The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale. It has been since man crawled out of the slime.
Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. My guest this evening is John Adams. John Adams is the co-host of Afternoon Commute. He's a regular contributor to the Hoaxbusters Call with Chris Kendall. John, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing very well, Tim. How are you tonight?
Very well, and thank you for coming back on the show. I think last time you were here was actually, I think it was December 20th. Here we are exactly 6 months later, June 20th, if I recall.
Oh, yes.
Well, tonight we'll have you back on. You've done a couple of talks recently with Chris, and you've covered. You're covering this book, this tome, Mystic Chords of Memory, and you covered a few other topics: consumerism, media fakery. I think you had an interesting discussion regarding Jules' Henry book, Culture Against Men. And you talked about how consumerism is promoted by the oligarchs as a process of sort of converting the mass of humanity into sort of these debt-ridden zombies. And I thought that was an interesting concept, how consumerism can sort of break down the critical thought and make people sort of sheep-like. But anyway, I'm going to let you take it from here. How do you want to go into this conversation?
The good thing about having conversations with you is you have your own take on things as well. Listening to the conversations that Chris and I have. So basically, one thing that I've discovered over the years of looking into, every once in a while, I'll get down a rabbit trail onto looking into the nature of advertising and marketing in postmodern society, and the more I look into it, the more it seems that it's not really about selling stuff. It's more about creating a human being to sell stuff to. And Bernays seems to talk about that early on. Like you mentioned, Culture Against Man by Jules Henry, this kind of obscure book that I found, and he goes into it. But basically, it wasn't just the idea of creating a human being to be able to just solely advertise and market stuff to. It was actually creating a person in the postmodern world who was going to be able to believe anything that he is told by when it's coming from a quote-unquote reputable source. And those type of people didn't exist at one time, who were completely and totally pliable, malleable. They needed to be broken down through the system of television, entertainment, and advertising, conspicuous consumerism. And it was through that process of creating the person to become the consumer that that the method that they used to create that culture created a person who is going to be now or in the future is going to be able to buy into the idea that artificial intelligence is real, that planes fly into buildings and the nose comes out the other side of the building, and or the airplane collapses the building. A person who is going to buy into the idea that all of these shootings, these people have got just great accuracy when it comes to machine gunning people or whatever you want to call it. They don't take into account facts or anything like that. They don't take into account reality. That comes from mass amounts of entertainment and advertising, where you suspend your idea of reality to be able to engage in this thought processes. Jules Henry talks about this in his book Culture Against Man, where he talks about how advertising language, the language of advertising, is not actually designed for you to really believe it. Because if you took the example of, and he gives multiple examples, if you just took the example of something like, this car performs like a bat out of hell, that's something that is kind of folk banter between, Tim ran like a bat out of hell. What they did is they took natural things that people say to each other in a more more folk-like setting, turn those things into advertising to sell products, right? But advertising, interestingly enough, in another time period, it wasn't really so manipulative. It was actually just more kind of fact-based. So if you got a trade magazine or something like that, it would have a picture of a watch, and it basically told you what the watch does. Fast forward to the golden age of advertising in the 1950s, and this is basically Bernays, on high octane at this point. They've pretty much mastered a lot of the stuff from the time in the 1920s, with Bernays coming up with the ideas of the freedom torches with the cigarettes and that type of stuff. By the time you get around to the 1950s and 1960s, they are literally selling the idea of dreams and lifestyles, and no longer is it about how a watch performs or what it actually does functionally. Now it's this man, the watch makes the man.
Yeah.
And you can't be a man unless you have this watch. So the advertising, the language of advertising in and of itself is unbelievable, because it actually literally cannot take place in reality. A car cannot literally perform like a bat out of hell.
This is why in the 60s you see a sports car being driven on the beach.
Yes, exactly. Henry has comes up with this theory of of advertising as a philosophical system, and he talks about advertising being a pecuniary philosophy because it's the language of making money. he has this quote right here on page 49. He says, "Most people are not obsessive truth seekers. They do not yearn to get to the bottom of things. They are willing to let absurd or merely ambiguous statements pass. And this undemandedness that does not insist that the world would stand up and prove that it is the real thing, this air of relaxed woolly-mindedness is a necessary condition for the development of the revolutionary mode of thought herein called pecuniary philosophy. The relaxed attitude toward veracity or mendacity, depending on the point of view, and its complement, pecuniary philosophy, are important to the American economy, for they make possible an enormous amount of selling that could not otherwise take place. Every culture creates philosophy out of its own needs, and ours has produced traditional philosophies based on truth, verifiable," turning the page, "by some primordial objective or supernatural criteria, and another pecuniary philosophy derived from an irrational need to sell. The heart of truth in our traditional philosophies was God or his equivalent, such as an identifiable empirical reality. The heart of truth in pecuniary philosophy is contained in the following three postulates. Truth is what sells. Truth is what you want people to believe. Truth is that which is not legally false."
Legally false. I like that. That's like, well, I guess legally, it's the same with legally true, right? I guess it's
absolutely. So
legally false.
So in order for you to engage advertising, you can't even exist in an objective state of mind. You have to exist in a subjective state of mind.
Yes.
Because truth in and of itself becomes a plastic term. And of course, I think we may have discussed this on a past talk, but I'm sure you're familiar with Politics in the English Language by George Orwell, and he goes into a particular part of that. He goes into the word fascist, and how the word fascist, by the time he's writing this essay, has become a pretty malleable term. It can pretty much, fascist used to have this particular meaning of, a fascist government is a government that is, equally corporate as it is government.
Yeah, as Mussolini defined it, yeah.
Right. And it had this particular meaning, and by the time, and you'll even hear this with the 60s radicals, and then today, even with the, with the recent nonsense going on at the colleges, with all of the social justice warriors, the term fascist now just means, violent people.
Yeah.
I even heard there was that teacher who was causing all the trouble at Berkeley, and I saw an interview with her, and she was on Tucker Carlson, and he asked her, well, what does fascism mean to you? And she said, well, fascism is anybody who projects violence and wants to be violent. And, being a part of the mainstream media, he didn't really even press her on that. It was just kind of, well, but he didn't press her on that particular incorrect definition.
Yeah.
But that is not the correct definition, and so later on in the essay, I don't have the essay handy right now, but he talks about the word freedom being basically a malleable term that you can just mold and shape it into anything you want, and freedom is only as good as what you currently have. So the freedom that existed 50 years ago was different than the freedom that exists today, but yet we're still told that it's freedom. And it's supposedly the same definition as the word that existed 50 years ago that it existed 50 years before that.
Yeah.
When we get into the book Mystic Chords of Memory by Michael Kammen, he basically, without saying what I just said, backs it all up, that as you go down through the ages, not only is freedom a word based around mythology and and kind of just a shady kind of. There's not a real definition for it. It just basically is attributed to whatever age you live in, and it's built around these myths and traditions that come out of the myths themselves. So he talks about how by the time he's writing this in 1990, that authors had started using the word tradition and myth as interchangeable words, and they have distinct meanings in of themselves, tradition and myth. Problem is, what I came to a conclusion about is that traditions come out of myths. And I'm not saying all traditions are bad. I'm not saying traditional ideas are bad. But what he specifically is talking about in this book, for the most part, is national traditions, and the idea of things that come out of alleged events within particularly America's history.
Mm-hmm.
And so when monuments get built to things, when holidays are celebrated, those type of things are basically untrue.
Yeah,
and
like
even if an event did happen, the truth was never fully told about the event. And he actually goes into great detail. I mean, I know you said you picked up a copy of this book. This,
yes.
How many pages? This is like a 900 page book. He gets into great detail, detailing how it not only, it's not only just the truth is not only the casualty of government influence or something like that, but it's also the casualty of just historians taking kind of leisure with facts
mm-hmm.
as well.
That and also historiography
itself
is highly politicized. I think there was a term I came across in Francis Stoner Saunders' book, The Cultural Cold War, and it was historiographical catechism. Meaning there's certain beliefs, articles of faith that you must ascribe to be accepted as a credentialed historian or just even a member of polite society. Often these truths, in quotation marks, these beliefs don't bear, the slightest scrutiny or examination. Yet, if you want to be accepted in polite society, we must repeat them and not challenge them.
Absolutely, and with it's been going on in all generations. It's kind of getting a little bit wild today because we're dipping our toe in the absurd reality, I guess you would say the pure lack of reality, especially when it comes to mass communication, mass media.
When you get into historical analysis itself and how historiography, if you just go back, we're supposed to be studying history, and of course, if history already happened, how come what happened always changes? Well, because it's not subject to interpretation, right? So, what's emphasized, what isn't?
Right. Have you started looking at that book?
The Mystic Chords of Memory?
Yeah.
No, it's sitting there on my stack of yet to be read books.
Okay.
But I intend
to
get
one thing he talks about is that when they were founding the country or whatever, and in the throes of that, there was this idea, and it's probably a Freemasonic one, because that's the foundations of the country is based around, and I guarantee you a lot of these early historians are Freemasons too, so they don't just adhere to, they keep their lips shut pretty tightly. I would have to say Mr. Kammen doesn't even mention Freemasonry at all in his book either, so that's kind of strange considering he's dealing with history here too.
Yeah, occult societies and secret societies simply don't get much treatment in standard historical accounts.
No. How
do you study political science and not take into account the role of occult or secret societies? You really can't, and it's like studying. It's like denying the fact that organized crime exists and trying to study criminology or trying to study 20th century American history without acknowledging the fact that there was organized crime. They just overlook
Sure.
it.
There's only two times in American history that you will actually see Freemasonry get mentioned in a kind of mainstream perspective. Save the last 15 years.
Yeah.
I'd say in the last 15 years, like, the cat's out of the bag pretty much. So they write these history books, and I've actually got a couple of them up there on the shelf here. But if you're talking about, like, the body of work from the late 19th century on up into the early 21st century, you have a body of work that only mentions it twice, and that would be during, the era of, like, John Quincy Adams with the anti-Mason party.
Yeah, and the death of the guy Morgan, the murder.
Yeah, William Morgan.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the only other time you're going to hear about it is kind of like referenced in the, like, post World War II, when organizational culture kind of blossomed, and it's more referenced in kind of like, oh yeah, everybody on the block was either a Shriner, a Mason, or a Rotary Club member. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of looked at as kind of this novelty time period, like that's where Dad went down and had a couple of beers and a plate of spaghetti every Wednesday night, mm-hmm. type thing. But it doesn't really get mentioned seriously as an influence on history and culture, probably because most of the guys writing these books are probably in some sort of society, not necessarily all Freemasons or anything like that, but they definitely have some. They know something that they're not supposed to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And so, so one thing Mr. Kammen here talks about is at the founding of the country, they were not even interested in telling, like, in school and colleges, there was no history classes because there wasn't really any history of the country to talk about. And certainly up until the mid to late 1800s, there started to be kind of this push towards teaching history. The only problem with it is that in this new world order that was being born out of the creation of America, the idea from the get-go, he talks about it in here. This is not me just saying this, but I definitely know this to be true, not just from reading this book, is that the idea of America was founded on perpetual progress and always moving forward, never looking backward type of thing. The only thing is once you got up into the mid-1800s and into the 19th century, they kind of found out that people like nostalgia and they like history. But what nostalgia and history became useful for was to use it as kind of a trigger mechanism or attach it to ideas to move things forward. So you use the past in order to push new ideas. And so once again, you kind of have, and I was talking about this on the call with Chris too, is that even in politics and government or anything like that, advertising and marketing in and of itself is necessary to be able to sell things to the public. You got to sell wars, you got to sell taxes, you have to sell all sorts of new stuff to people. And it takes basically advertising and marketing to be able to do that. 9/11 was a big, giant advertisement for the war on terror. That's all that it was. It was a commercial.
Yeah, if you think about, well, figures like we're talking about advertising, and you mentioned the opening about the use of slogans and how the language advertising is separated from reality, and we kind of suspend our disbelief and acknowledge these things, that what's being advertised has nothing to really do with the truth. It's just it gets a caricature or exaggeration of the truth, and we kind of accept that. Same with political speech. We know that there's exaggerations and told all the time. But the one thing that's interesting is the overlap between advertising, journalism, and psychological warfare, or we want to call that intelligence. And people like Walter Lippmann, Edward Bernays are perfect examples of that. Both involved in propaganda, ads, and these things. Of course, you also have other figures like Edward Lansdale, who came from the world of advertising, went into the military intelligence during World War II, and really never got out of advertising because it's the same thing. And even a lower figure like E. Howard Hunt, who after he supposedly retired from the CIA, went to work for the Robert Mullen Company, which was a CIA, wouldn't call it a front company, but it was an ad agency that often worked with the CIA to give agents cover. And this was apparently what it was doing for E. Howard Hunt when he supposedly retired from the CIA. But obviously, what we're dealing with here, when you're dealing with someone like a Walter Lippmann or Edward Bernays or even Ed Lansdale, we can all boil it down to, at some level, it's psychological warfare at a varying degree. It's all about mass manipulation of information, telling all type, whether it's black propaganda, gray propaganda, or white propaganda. It's all about, buffaloing or hoodwinking the public to achieve some sort of marketing objective or geopolitical objective. And that's, if you study the careers of all those men, you see it heavily overlaps. One thing, just someone like Walter Lippmann, who's an obvious propagandist, talk about, I guess he wrote the book, was it Public Opinion was his book? And about manipulating mass public opinion, and these things using all types of psychological warfare tactics, lying to the public, misinforming the public to get a reaction out of the public that you may want for political reasons. He's also, it's admitted that was a big part of his function during the inquiry with the Woodrow administration, the Creel Committee, and these things. At the same time, he's lauded as a great journalist. And he won the Pulitzer Prize.
Well, that's
geez.
That's because on the to use a terminology from back when I was in high school, on the down low, as they used to say, Mr. Lippmann was a member of the Round Table, and he was a editor of the Round Table magazine, and he was counsel on foreign relations. I think he's in some sort of directorship at that time. And so, yes, he's this very famous guy. I don't even think it really comes out to public knowledge about Mr. Lippmann being a CFR / Roundtable contributor, at least fully, until either Tragedy and Hope or maybe like Dan Smoot's The Invisible Government, which that's written in like 1961 or something like that. So even 30 years after the fact, because Lippmann's a Roundtable member like in the 20s and 30s, I think. And so we're not talking about just average people here. We're not; these aren't your local newscasters. I was saying on a previous call with Chris too that someone like Tom Brokaw is a Council on Foreign Relations director.
Mm-hmm. So
Tom Brokaw, that guy everybody's trusted for the entire 1980s and 90s, is a CFR member. You can correct me later if I'm wrong. I think at one time he was the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. He may have succeeded Peter Peterson. Because Peter Peterson, who was president of the Council on Foreign Relations for a long time, who was also he's also the owner of the Blackstone Group, the mergers and acquisitions company, with Stephen Schwartzman, who is a Skull and Bones graduate from Yale. Yeah, interestingly enough, you just think about that, like, I mean, just anybody who's listening to this, just think about this. The world's biggest mergers and acquisitions firm is run by the president of the Council on Foreign Relations.
Nothing to see here, folks. Move along.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they also, I mean, CFR, it's Council on Foreign Relations, just if you want to get a diagram, really an idea of how full spectrum dominance is executed through entertainment, through the media, through government. They bring in celebrities. I mean, it's there for everyone to see.
The other, and then think about this: the Skull and Bones Society is well known. That's where the CIA is kind of born out of.
Mm-hmm.
So the other guy who runs the world's biggest mergers and acquisitions firm comes from where the CIA was born out of. So think about that. You've got the one guy is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. The other guy is probably some sort of CIA operative.
Yeah.
And yeah, so the thing of it is that's not just complete and total circumstantial evidence, because anybody who's read Tragedy and Hope, he basically kicks it all down right in there. Oh yeah, there's these bankers, and they're all in the CIA, and they all not only are they bankers, but they're also lawyers.
Mm-hmm.
And not only are they lawyers, but they're also advertising men. And not only are they advertising men, but they also write spy novels and movie scripts.
That's right.
And they're all Council on Foreign Relations members on top of it.
Like Edward Bernays, because everyone talks about Edward Bernays, but just he's the guy that got he worked with the Woodrow Wilson administration, convinced America to go off and be killed in the trenches of World War I. In the 1920s, he's convincing women that smoking is an act of rebellion, torches of liberty. I think in the 1950s, he's working behind the scenes to support the CIA's coup in Guatemala by convincing the public that, the government then, Arbenz government, is indeed communist. So he's creating public support for a covert operation. I think it's kind of interesting because you got to create the whole thing, the whole meme, I guess, of communist infiltration. And this is done. In this case, he's not working for the CIA. He's contracted with the United Fruit Company. Of course, at the time, the Dulles brothers were on the board of the United Fruit Company. So that shows you just how integrated this whole thing is. We're not just talking about CIA proper here. This is CIA is an agency, and its principal are the people that own the United Fruit Company, which is, the oligarchy or Illuminati, for lack of a better term. But that's how they created these agencies, to do that, to execute these policies.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, Bernays was a player. He's kind of he's an interesting guy. I've probably listened to every interview that's out there with him. Of course, read propaganda. He's an interesting guy. He's a very smart guy. I can tell he's very intelligent. I mean that in two ways. And no doubt he probably came up with a lot of stuff on his own, but he just happens to be the nephew of Sigmund Freud. Of course, he admits to a lot of the ideas of how they were going to promote the idea of advertising and public relations in its new golden age type form. Kind of comes out of the Freudian research.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't even really call it research. I get suspicious of Mr. Bernays and Mr. Freud as being kind of rock star guys. I mean, I'm sure they were genuinely smart and like I said, genuinely knew a lot about type of stuff, but I guarantee you, as it's come out in other things, that these guys aren't totally as smart as they're made out to be, but they're projected out there as kind of rock stars.
Yeah, because they need the same way you need a Betty Crocker or a or a Ronald McDonald.
Absolutely,
you need a Bernays or a Freud to promote something. Yeah.
H.G. Wells. It's well known that H.G. Wells had an entire writing team behind him, helping him write his books.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Most of these authors out there today, it's the same thing. It's any one of these modern artists. You're going to find out that Andy Warhol kind of started this stuff, which he has intelligence connections. I'm sure you know that. But one of these things is, a lot of these people who are considered these brilliant geniuses, and you think, oh, he's the guy. Well, actually, they have teams and teams of people making this stuff happen. And I'm thinking Mr. Bernays and Mr. Freud had that as well with their research and all that type of stuff. They give you these movies and this nonsense that, here's Freud in his crusty little Austrian office, and he's got these people, and he's taking his time interviewing each one of them, and as he interviews these people and finds out what their desires are, he's coming to these conclusions and writing these books about all of his thoughts and all that type of stuff. Not so sure about all that. It seems more like a concerted effort moving in a particular direction to be able to figure out certain things about humans in general, and then using those generalities through the research, and probably research teams, considering what we know about Germany and Vienna and that kind of area of the world at that particular time. Is there's no doubt about it that area of the world is full of, at that time period, is full of brilliant people.
Mm-hmm. So all the patents and everything, yeah.
Yeah, it wouldn't be beyond speculation to just think like that these guys probably had research teams looking at this information that they're getting out of this new field of quote-unquote psychoanalysis. Also, you see psychoanalysis aiding in what I was talking about earlier in the creation of this kind of neurotic person who is going to whose status and self-worth depends on material possession.
And the idea that neurosis is derived from what the general public would consider moral inhibition.
Yes, yeah, to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that.
That's how psychiatry itself is sort of a weapon.
Well, it's hard to explain, but basically, what they did is there wasn't a problem with something, but they brought those guys over here, and then they created a problem by just asking questions, and started to get people weakened with the ideas of asking questions, and then. At that time period, you've got Industrial Revolution really kicking in, and so you have this kind of transition, especially with the modern person. And I say modern from that time period's perspective, is there's this transitory phase of moving the people out of the agricultural idea into the idea of in industry working for the robber barons. You have religion moving in this direction of telling people that in order to have any self-worth or, to have any, to be a good Christian is to work hard in the factories. Out of that, you have this, and then later on, you have the kind of prosperity gospel blossoming out of that. Once that's kind of been taken, once the Industrial Revolution kind of took hold here in America. But see, the transition period was very hard for people to move out of agriculture into industrialization. So yes, there were a lot of problems. There was also a lot of problems with people who were involved with wars.
Yeah, the trauma of war itself, which is a huge social engineering project in and of itself. Yeah, absolutely.
And to create the more weak-minded male that came out of those wars, it's always interesting that they project the projection, the advertising, the marketing that goes into selling war is that you have these strong men, these young, strong, strapping young lads that are going to get sent into the meat grinder, and then they come back and they're totally mind bombed and withered away as men. And
that was something that Tavistock noticed, and not to cure it, but to weaponize it in Great Britain, the Tavistock Institute.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So, interestingly enough, I've got some other interesting quotes from around this time period.
Just one observation, though. I think I mentioned this in this email, because you mentioned the function of the war and Bernays and advertising is that I think I mentioned in the email that what I noticed is that the same process by which Bernays and his minions or his colleagues will transform men into mindless consumers, it also the very similar process is used to turning them into mindless jingoists, and they're willing to go off and go into the trenches and go over the top and get mowed down by automatic weapon fire.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah. I think what happens, especially around the time period of World War I, which is interesting, which is an interesting thing in and of itself, because that was definitely an exercise in mass psychology, mass mind manipulation. For the most part, when that war started, the entire country was absolutely 100% against getting involved with the war.
Mm-hmm.
Go back and read any mainstream history book, any alternative history book. It'll basically support that. There was not even an iota of anybody thinking about, America needs to go get involved with this. Fast forward to the election of Woodrow Wilson, and of course you have another one of these insider guys like Bernays or Lippmann, and that would be Colonel Edward Mandell House,
mm-hmm.
Running the Wilson administration. And just from that time period alone, you have a complete shift to actually, now we need to go round up, we need to round up Krauts. In America, we need to round up Germans. We need to go get the Germans. We need to kill, a derogatory term for Germans back during World War II is calling men Fritz.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of effort put into just shifting people's ideas from the time of the start of the war. By the time Wilson gets into office, they had totally turned it around to where people were going. And that's not to say that there wasn't a large anti-war sentiment, because there still was during that war. A lot less anti-war sentiment during World War II, but there still was more anti-war sentiment during World War I. But they had basically pretty much sold everybody on the idea that the Germans were evil and we need to go get them. So,
there was the Kaiser was going to come and rape your wife, and of course, in the final analysis, it was Woodrow Wilson who was passing the Alien and Sedition Acts and the Espionage Acts, which violated pretty much all the Bill of Rights. You couldn't criticize the war. You couldn't criticize any governmental policy without risk of being arrested. And I think Eugene Debs was sentenced to 20 years in prison for criticizing the draft. And so, who was a bigger threat to your liberty, the Kaiser or Woodrow Wilson?
Right. And what was Debs, the head of the Socialist Party?
Yeah, he was, and it was he wasn't released until Warren G. Harding assumed office in 1921 and released him.
Yeah. So the leaders of these movements and guys, and Kaiser, Wilhelm, and all that type of stuff. I don't really. I'm not in any way taking any issue with what you're saying. I totally agree with what you're saying. But just to focus less on the leaders and the issues, it's the thing that always perturbs me the most about conflicts is that this is just basically aimed at getting the average person to dislike other average people. Like the famous quote from Tammany Hall. What was the Tammany Hall quote? I can always get half the poor to kill the other half.
Yeah. Yeah, it's get people to hate their perceived immediate enemy as opposed to the string pullers.
What was the name of the guy who ran Tammany Hall during the Civil War?
Boss Tweed?
Do you remember him?
Boss Tweed?
Boss Tweed, yeah, that's right. Boss Tweed. Yeah. So that's a Boss Tweed quote there. But here, let me get on this track and see what you got to say about this. Mm-hmm. I've got a couple of things laid out here in front of me. So first of all, I've got a book here called The American College and University: A History by Frederick Rudolph. Here's what it says. And I'm making a point here, so but it'll take me a minute to get to it. I hope you don't mind.
Yeah, we're commercial free, listener supported, so go right ahead.
Yeah, no marketing or advertising. So the extension of women's education was the function of two agencies. The land-grant colleges and the state universities where coeducation took hold, and a trio of new women's colleges which contributed heavily toward elevating the standards and the reputation of collegiate education for women. First, the University of Iowa in 1855 and the University of Wisconsin in 1863 opened their doors to women, followed by Indiana, Missouri, Michigan, and California. The readiness of Western institutions to adopt coeducation unquestionably derived in part from the facts of Western life, where an equality of the sexes was achieved in the ordinary work of the farm. Western woman was not a thing apart, neither pampered nor fragile. Perhaps she was not even as feminine as she might be, but she was a person in her own right who had commanded the respect of her menfolk by assuming responsibility and working hard. This next quote is from The Demoralization of Society, From Victorian Virtues to Modern Values by Gertrude Himmelfarb. If you don't know who Gertrude Himmelfarb is, she is the wife of Irving Kristol, the mother of William Kristol, a neoconservative, a former commie, a former Trotskyite, just like Irving Kristol.
Are there any former Trotskyites?
I say former in quotation marks. So the one thing I've noticed about the neoconservatives, especially the early ones like Kristol and his wife here, they actually make some really good points in their book. The only thing is they're always attached to the neoconservative idea, kind of like, William Bennett. You might read a William Bennett book and there's some good things in his book of virtues or something, but it's always attached to these neoconservative philosophies. So anyway, she hips me to something here in this book I did not know, and I thought it was really, really interesting. You learn something new every day. It's in a chapter called The New Women and the New Men. Contemporaries did not use the term new men, but they did speak of new women. This expression came into use in the early 1890s, about the same time as feminist. And like the latter, it can be read backward in time, at least to the 1880s. While the two terms were sometimes used interchangeably, they were essentially different. The feminists were women with a cause, or with several causes. The suffrage education, work, birth control, or some specific reform that was especially pertinent to women. The new women had no particular cause, only the larger, more general cause of social and sexual liberation. Again, as with feminists, new women was applied to a wide spectrum of women. In its broadest sense, it was used to describe the fast, young woman who wore bloomers, rode bicycles, played tennis and golf, smoked in public, read Bernard Shaw and Ibsen, and shocked their elders by conversing about free love before settling down to marriage, home, and children. Some contemporaries were aware of what historians are now discovering. Okay, this is really interesting here. You ready for this one, Tim? That bicycles liberated more women than did the advanced ideas of new women or even the reforms achieved by the feminists. Writing in 1895 in The Lady Cyclist, one of the scores of women's journals that flourished in the 1890s. How much you want to bet if you looked into the history of that magazine? It was Rockefeller Foundation funded. One enthusiast said that cycling was responsible for a new dawn, a dawn of emancipation. Another woman, a trade union organizer, admitted that the bicycle is doing more for the independence of women than anything expressly designed to that end. A woman could go cycling unaccompanied by a chaperone or maid. It was perhaps the first amusement she took upon to please herself and not a man. It required comfortable attire. It was absolutely independent and yet not necessarily unsociable. So I'm guessing they knew that, and like I said, and I know you're aware of this too. Along with advertising and all the marketing and all that other stuff, the modern magazines were all run by intelligence agencies as well, or funded into existence by Rockefeller, i.e., McCall's Ladies' Home Journal, all those type of things. Those all came about at the turn of the century. It was all social engineering. I mean, that's come out in multiple books that those women's magazines were first designed social engineering. Maybe today, you pick up a Good Housekeeping or something like that, and it's got some killer recipe for, seared tuna or something. It's not really that generation and life changing. Back at the turn of the century, or circa 1940s, 50s, that type of stuff, those type of things were brand new, and they were the vehicles driving change.
Yeah, because that was the major media at the time.
Yes,
yeah.
And like they're pointing out, those, you see, that's one of the things that I think Chris and I try our best to do is go back and look at some of these things that people don't realize were, there's kind of things that are pointed to, especially in alternative media or alternative history or alternative research, is kind of these obvious things that have been around for years. You might get into this information for the first time and you get hip to the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, all that type of stuff, and there's all of these kind of obvious things, but then you don't think about all of the things that culturally have actually been thought about. I guarantee you there's no accident that bicycles were promoted for women just around the same time that the feminist New Woman suffragette movement is taking place. Yes,
yeah. And the whole idea, the whole motivation behind that, giving women the right to vote, the myth of political power, because even by then, being by the 1920s, the oligarchs had this electoral system locked down, and so they could afford to give women the vote, and this weakened the family, because this weakened
absolutely,
the male authority. Before that, the family was a corporate, sort of a corporate structure, and it was represented primarily through the male. But I think I pointed out to Chris, if you look at campaign ads, even before women had attained the right to vote, they appealed to women, because a woman would then exert her influence on the man.
sure, that's an old thing. I mean, even advertising in the golden age of advertising, 50s and 60s, it's all directed towards women. There's an entire chapter about that in The Hidden Persuaders by Vance Packard, where he talks about how there's I believe the chapter is called The Feminization of the Male.
Mm-hmm.
And he's talking exactly about that. He says that advertising is directed primarily towards women, and that by the time he's writing that book in the 50s, it had gotten to a point to where the advertising is basically telling the woman that she needs to dress her man. She needs to tell her man that if he's not wearing the right suit, then he's not a man. And I think he gives an example in there of, the guy who existed in the time period before. He had one suit, he had a pair of overalls, and, a nice pair of shoes, and then his work shoes.
Mm-hmm.
And that was pretty much it. And the advertising that came along after that was basically telling women, hey, if your man doesn't have the new style suit that comes out, or the new hat, especially in the 50s and 60s when hats, were very important for men. All men wore hats. It was kind of we can't really relate it to being a fad, because I don't think like someone you or my age or anybody younger is going to understand like men wearing hats back then. It was just like kind of something everybody did.
Mm-hmm.
And we weren't really raised in a generation like that. But what happened was, the man owning a hat or, maybe two hats wasn't good enough. No, now they had seasonal hats, and this was, now you need a hat for every season or something like that, a different suit for every season, a different pair of shoes. And so all of these things that we kind of take for granted today, they were actually born not only out of just, social engineering, but also out of trying to figure out new ways to sell, to sell things. How are we going to sell, how are we going to sell more pairs of shoes if the demand for shoes is stagnated at, well, this guy buys a new pair of shoes every 10 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they had to come up with new and inventive ways to be able to do that. And so it's like you were pointing out, it's long been directed at the woman to be able to motivate the man to do something about it. Carol Quigley points to two things that it not only, especially in the last chapter of Tragedy and Hope, the obvious thing that's pointed to a lot of the time is sex. Sex is the motivator, but the type of man that existed in a previous era, we don't know what he was like either. And men, whereas sex is a motivator when you're kind of younger, it's not really that kind of a motivator once you're in your late 30s and your 40s, that type of thing. And especially when in that previous time period, those were the type of men who were kind of established and had a secure kind of lifestyle.
Yeah.
The one thing Quigley points out, especially pertaining to those type of men, and if you notice this, in a prior time period, some women, a good portion of women used to marry older men, whereas like someone like myself or yourself, and our generation and Generation X. You're a Gen Xer.
Yeah.
See, we married people our own age, or in a general vicinity. a lot of times in past generations, women would marry older men.
Yeah, that was much more common,
Yeah, because that man was a lot more established, had more security, that type of thing. One thing that Quigley points out is especially the Western, what he calls the middle-class bourgeois, is that those men were motivated by nagging. And that this was it sounds funny, but it's actually sociologically recognized that this is kind of something that is that you can attribute to Western females. I'm not saying it doesn't exist in other cultures, but in the same kind of way that, I guess, I don't want to say we. I don't know about your situation, but I say we collectively. What's portrayed in mass media? Let's say that the kind of woman who's portrayed in Western mass media as kind of this nagging housewife. That was the great motivator for men to go to work. That's what Quigley is saying in Tragedy and Hope.
You have to pay for the washing machine and the vacuum cleaner in the car.
Absolutely. And so the admin, the madmen, as they were called in the TV series, is they realize this, and then they use the advertising to motivate it. Well, now I'm going to nag you to get a new suit because your suit's looking too shabby. Are you really going to wear that shirt to the party? You're not really going to wear that, are you? You're not really going to wear that hat, are you? Those type of things.
Yeah, this is the status that counts, the perceived status in society. Yeah.
Which interestingly enough, Vance Packard's next book after The Hidden Persuaders was The Status Seekers, where he goes over how that particular time period is full of people who are kind of obsessed with material objects and material possession for the purpose of status seeking. And it's interesting. I picked out a quote from the book here to kind of go along with this. And I don't know if you're familiar with the writer William Maxwell.
Not really, no.
Okay, so he was an author from the New Yorker magazine,
mm-hmm.
and he's kind of like I guess you could say a postmodernist kind of writer. I believe he fell into the category of a socialist, but he writes kind of these stories of of kind of just like average America at the time that he's living in. These just kind of, I get, if you're familiar with the way stories are written in the New Yorker, they're at least in older times, it's kind of portraying this idea of average America. And I thought this passage here was pretty interesting, and kind of goes along with what we're talking about. So this is from the book So Long, See You Tomorrow. And he says he could not have loved Fern more if she had been his own daughter. To an outsider, it seemed that Aunt Jenny was relegated to the position of waiting on them. Waiting on them was her whole pleasure, and she did not ask herself whether they valued her sufficiently or at all. Innocence is defined in dictionaries as freedom from guilt or sin, especially through lack of knowledge, purity of heart, blamelessness, guilelessness, artlessness, simplicity, etc. There is no aspect of the word that does not apply to her. Without that heavy-set aristocratic man snoring away on the side of the bed, without that fresh-eyed child whose hair ribbon needed retying, without the conversation at meals and the hearty appetites and getting dressed for church on time, without the tears of laughter and the worry about making both ends meet, the unpaid bills, the layoffs, both seasonal and unexpected, without the toys that have to be picked up lest someone trip over them, and the 7 shirts that have to be washed and ironed, for one for every day in the week, without the scraped knee, the hurt feelings, the misunderstandings that need to be cleared up, the voice calling for her, so that she's perpetually having to stop what she is doing and go see what they want. Without all of this, what have you? A mystery. How is it she didn't realize it was going to last such a short time? What he's describing there is something like you or I experienced, Tim, as we've discussed, is when you're living a life, a simple kind of life, and you're not involved with mass culture, mass media, you don't have any time to do anything. So, and when you have like a normal kind of family life, you are more, what they're describing there is a woman fulfilled.
Yes.
She's fulfilled by all of the daily things. She's fulfilled by the fact that she's needed, and it's not, and like he's describing there, it's not something that's spoken out loud. It's just known. It's just the way that it is.
Mm-hmm.
And what you had at this with this change in the roles of women and the roles of men, were people who were unfulfilled, but they had been provided all of the things telling them, well, see, this is why you're unfulfilled, because you don't have a brand new suit. Okay? Then the psychoanalysis comes in. Oh, well, see, the reason you're unhappy is because you're not going to therapy. Okay? So then you have the public relations and the whole entire snowballing of this on down into the present day, where and then now
and then the psychotropic drugs eventually.
Absolutely. You have this snowballing down into the present day, where like I was saying before, like this is the kind of stuff Chris and I try to get into. Like we try to look at something that is like what is the foundation of this? Where does this come from? Where is this deriving from? And this is what I'm getting at with these type of things is you think of something as simplistic as cycling changing your entire culture. And someone listening to this will go, dude, that was so long ago. There's so many problems since then that, there's no way you're going to be able to get back to this, you're going back into these foundations. But see, what this does is, us having a discussion about this, is being able to recognize that the most simplistic thing that you don't recognize currently in today's world, the most simplistic things are having an effect on you, and those were probably thought about in think tanks, in meetings. They had meetings about this simple little thing that they were going to introduce into your life, and it was going to modify your behavior. It was going to change your behavior. Right? And you're not getting back to what I just read in the William Maxwell passage, not getting back to that simple thing where he's describing a woman fulfilled by a lifestyle that didn't involve mass culture, mass media, mass communication, advertising, psychoanalysis, all that type of stuff. Those things are basically, hey, we're going to create a problem, and then we're going to provide all the solutions for the problem that aren't really solutions, and people will be more unhappier, so they're going to need us even more to provide more solutions. Snowball. 100 years later, guess what? Here we are.
Yeah. Where depression and anxiety are rampant, despite all the material goodies that people have. And of course, a lot of the financial burdens are created because of all the material goodies they have. So, are you really happier with all the, with all the stuff? But you are in debt.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's another thing. unfortunately, someone like myself, I do really try to make an effort to live on the lighter side of things, although I do have quite large book collection here. Yes. I know people personally who are very unhappy in their lives, and they make a lot of money. I mean, I could do a lot with the money they make, personally. Mm-hmm. I could do a lot of really cool stuff with that kind of money that they make, and they are just unhappy. They're the type of people who come from home from work, they collapse, they're watching 6 hours of television, drinking. I'm sure everybody knows somebody like this currently, especially people my age. This seems to be kind of the norm, is like binge watching TV and
Yeah. I mean, if they just turned the TV off and actually sat down and read a book, they might feel less anxious and find something interesting, something, and start to think again. Whereas, the TV, or probably more so, the computer now robs you of that. It depends what you use the computer for. I think most bandwidth is still used for pornography. So, but and of course, what you mentioned about the bicycle, it counts in spades with the invention of radio. And we know that through the Radio Research Project, the Princeton Radio Research Project, and how mass communication was studied. Christopher Simpson's book, The Science of Coercion, gets into that. The whole study of mass communication wasn't there to study the effects of something that was occurring anyway. It was there to create mass communication for the purpose of weaponization, propaganda, World War II, the Cold War, to mold society, make it to marshal society in a certain direction for the purposes of the Cold War, which is all about control. I mean, you could say the same thing about the internet too. It came out of DARPA, the military. It's all been studied. I mean, if you look at this today, with whether it's Twitter or everyone's little phone devices and how that's changed behavior, that's changed dating habits, social skills, and these things. People don't no longer develop social skills anymore because they're stuck in the virtual world. You heard about, I've heard the new thing where you break up with a significant other, a girlfriend or a boyfriend, with a text message. Now, I don't know if that's embellished or exaggerated. I have to think.
Sure.
It still can't be that bad. But I said I'm not of that generation. So it's
yes.
But I do observe that people's behavior has changed, because everywhere I look, I see people crossing the street staring into a cell phone, not looking both ways.
Yeah,
adults.
Yeah, and I'll tell you one thing. I do use text for people. A lot of people, especially people my age, like, they don't want to communicate any other way.
Yeah.
So I do use text, but I'm very cognitively aware of what I'm doing. And here's one of the interesting things that I've noticed about text is it's basically like, I guess you could say that the internet itself is a hive mind kind of thing that they've, and there's lots of hive minds down through history that you could say, electricity was kind of a hive mind to start out with. It connected everybody. Mm-hmm. But as we, near closer and closer to the ultimate idea of the hive mind, a lot of texting, this is very interesting. I don't know if you use texting, but if you're aware of this, it's something that I don't think a lot of people think about. Not only has it changed, language and communication and that type of stuff, but many people who use texting, there is a perennial conversation taking place. Mm-hmm. It's an open-ended conversation that never ends. So let's say I send you a text. I say, "Hey, Tim, how's it going?" You say, "Oh, everything's been great. I'm just having a good time." "Oh, okay, sounds good. Yeah, I was out fishing today." You say, "Oh, cool." And then 2 weeks later, you send me a text we don't talk for 2 weeks or something. 2 weeks later, you send me a text, and it picks up where the conversation left off.
Yeah, yeah.
And people do this all the time. Like, it's just, and so it's kind of a hive mind where it's this like conversation that's always open. It's never closed. It's never resolved. It's just always there. And I'm not saying that you can't do that with people like, oh, well, I'm going to text my girlfriend, good night or whatever, and that conversation ends. But it's the beginning of this always having, always having this medium open. It's an open-ended thing that you can kind of pop in and out of anytime that you want to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in and of itself has kind of changed communication, just because in the past with a telephone call, you had to resolve the telephone call by hanging up.
Yes.
Right, and also you're not permanently on the phone. So with texting now, it's created this new pathway, I'd say, in the mind of people communicating, that there's always an open-ended conversation that you can just kind of slip into, like a chat room almost. It's like texting is personalized chat rooms.
Yeah, and there's just a running thread.
Yeah. So that has completely and totally just from that little aspect of it. Like I said, I don't hear too many people kind of talking about this, but something I've noticed is that aspect of communication in and of itself, of conversation, that is one altered thing that could kind of be used to pave the way for something else. Because now that's gotten you yourself used to a way of communication that didn't exist before. Not only did it not exist before, but it wasn't polite.
Yeah, and that's we're
the way that a lot of people communicate today would not have been acceptable in previous time periods.
Yeah, because for one thing, it was previous time periods. It was always in person, or there was a letter sent, and the letter was scarce, so a lot of time and effort was put into a letter, and people took an effort to think about what they were writing. Whereas you obviously don't get that on the internet or in texting in many cases, or when they Twitter or tweet rather is the verb, I think.
Absolutely.
I was wondering. Made a joke this weekend as I was talking about President Trump and his tweeting, and I said, "Well, he doesn't write those tweets. He's a tweet writer. He's a presidential tweet writer. It's a cabinet level position, I think now. So it's like,
yeah. Well, like Chris and I were saying is, maybe he does write his own tweets. He has a lot of time on his hands. He doesn't have anything to do.
And he's on the golf course. Not as he's deciding, foreign policy. He's not like,
no,
scouring congressional bills. What should I veto now because it violates the Constitution or something? As if he knows anything. It's like that's the myth of the president.
Absolutely,
the super busy president. Jimmy Carter was the epitome of that myth. He was supposed to be a hyper competent president, and even Saturday Night Live made a joke of that. But this idea. He might have actually thought he could do something. I don't know, but you're right. It's like I think Chris made the point when I talked to him is Washington, the president, the White House, the whole Washington D.C. is sort of a theatrical backdrop to how America perceives the country, how it's run. But it's not run from Washington D.C. That they're an agent, and that's why tourists come to Washington D.C. take a picture by the Capitol, by the White House, because they've seen it on TV, and by golly, whenever the reporters are talking about something important, that reporter is out in front of the Capitol, supposedly, or out in front of the White House.
Right. And
he's been in the White House because he's out in front of the White House. So he's got to know what he's talking about because he's in front of the building there.
Right. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is political theater, no doubt. two more things I wanted to bring up. I thought you would think this was interesting. Are you familiar with the book The Children of the Dream?
No.
Bruno Bettelheim. This will be fun for all of the people who think the Jews run everything. I'm not saying they don't run stuff.
They're an important faction. It's an important faction.
They are an important faction. They are not the ultimate faction, though. I'm sure that when you post this on YouTube, there's going to be plenty of comments saying that I'm a Zionist. But in any case,
I mean, of course, we need the elite.
Yes.
It's like you have to say that. It's like your typical Jew is as bamboozled and as befuddled as your typical Gentile. So there you go.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's the big Jews, not the little Jews.
Bruno Bettelheim. Dr. Bettelheim, he writes popular monthly column Dialogues with Mothers in the Ladies' Home Journal. And he's the director of orthogenic school at the University of Chicago, where he's a Rowley professor of education in the departments of psychology and psychiatry. He wrote this book, The Children of the Dream, Communal Child Rearing in American Education. And this is basically a study of the kibbutz. And he was writing this book to basically say that what we should do is implement the kibbutz system into America. Okay?
Okay.
But this is a very interesting quote, and then I'm going to couple this with a quote from Julian Huxley from Knowledge, Morality, and Destiny. So he says, not so long ago in the Western world, too, each family member had its own rightful place. Witness the specific place of the husband as husband, and the father as father, of the wife, of the mother, of the oldest son, etc. These have largely been obliterated. The result is a great deal of uncertainty about what is the rightful place of each family member in relation to others. For example, the father is no longer to exact obedience from his son, but the son is still expected to be more or less obedient, at least up to a certain age. But nobody is sure what exactly this age limit is and why it is set there. No longer is there a meaningful coming of age that frees the son of obedience, no special ceremony that changes the squire to a knight. For the kibbutz child or adult, there is no such insecurity about their relation to each other. Each has a place that belongs rightfully to him, and precisely because, as a youngster, he owns nothing. And in adulthood, so very little, his sense of belonging to the group is sharply heightened, exactly because the kibbutz youngster cannot fall back on other things that are his own room, his own records, his own books. The prospect of being excluded by the group is a devastating one. Without his rightful place there, nothing is left. Conversely, be sure of one's place might explain another striking contrast to what is typical in our society and why the kibbutz children is such a happy age. Not once did I observe any physical fighting amongst the kibbutz children. Not once did, beyond the age when they push each other down in the playpen, did I see a child pushing another one. Not one mention of hitting with the hand or object. This does not occur in the kibbutz. Now, anyways, he goes on to say how great and wonderful the Israeli communist kibbutz living is and how that needs to be implemented here. The one thing he doesn't talk about, because later on it came out that one of the downfalls of this experiment, this social engineering experiment in Israel, was that the children who grew up later actually tried to find their parents. Right, because in the kibbutz, what it was they would take the child from the parents and have a community raise the children. And a lot of them didn't end up knowing who their real parents were. But they were psychologically damaged by this experience because there was still some drive to find your real mother and father.
Yeah, it's primal. I mean, to know from where you came, yeah.
Right, and so a lot of things that have come out of this, and moving forward into the modern world here, is we see a similar thing that's taken place because you have a lot of same-sex couples who have gotten sperm donations. And this is something that happens quite often, where the children of these families grow up, and the kids have a drive within them to try to find out who the real father is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an instinctive drive to want to know where you came from, but it seems to be that this is some sort of thing that has been attempted to be driven out as you've de-escalated women from their pedestal that they should be on as mothers and caregivers,
mm-hmm.
as you brought the man down to literally just being a machine whose sole existence is to generate commerce and money, to not be a father to his children, to not be there to help the woman foster the children. You have this idea that's being built, and especially with millennials particularly, it did happen within Generation X as well, is a vast separation of family.
Yes.
And it's more so different than just, the idea of the nuclear family, or the idea that was happening in the 50s. Well, we're going to move away from home. We're going to move out here, to a different state to get a job, that type of stuff. That was the beginning of it. Now we kind of see something different where you have atomized families. You have atomized individuals that might even live in the same home, but they are the ultimate in automatons.
Yeah, and this is part of a long-running plan because, as you mentioned, there's different different phases in this program. But in the late 60s, you had Planned Parenthood with that, I think it was the Jaffe memo, talking about weakening the family through the promotion of sexual freedom, homosexuality.
Yeah, it's the Burleson memo.
The Burleson memo, yeah. And you also have it's funny because you have the authoritarian personality, which was published by the Cultural Marxists, the American Jewish Committee. And they talked about how you had to go after primarily the father, but to do this, to target the father figure, you weaken the family because there's something inherently fascist about it all. And so these programs, and you see it laid out in the 50s and 60s, the normalization of pornography with Playboy magazine. You have, of course, you have the Kinsey reports and his books on male and female sexuality, which were all promoted by Time Life and the Rockefellers. Of course, the introduction of the pill, which was a Rockefeller project promoting sexual freedom. And you also have the, Helen Gurley Brown over there at Cosmo, another person probably should be investigated, see if she has any intelligence ties, like Gloria Steinem. Of course, Gloria Steinem, the whole feminist movement, these things. So it's all being played out. And all this is to create that atomization that you speak of today. And these everyone's damaged goods. Of course, that was another play that was promoted by Edward Bernays. Yeah. So everyone's scarred and damaged by this. And that's their intent. That's their purpose. And
absolutely. And see, what you have is the, I think what has happened over a long period of time is there was a goal, and there was, a lot of different experiments going on. Like I said, this one happening in Israel with the kibbutz. The world is a laboratory, and there's been all sorts of different experiments going on trying to eliminate the drives that you were born with.
Yeah, it's a war on human nature. It's a war on nature.
Yeah, it's a redirection. You know, it's trying to redirect all sorts, heighten and redirect all sorts of drives. So it's like you're talking about with sexuality. You know,
can be anything more basic than that? I mean, than sexuality. Can anything more simple than that to figure out its purpose? Yet they confuse the heck out of it.
Well, the interesting part about it here's it's a long game scenario, and I don't think most people ever really think about this. But here's what you do: you take it, you exploit it, you mass culturize it.
Mm-hmm.
You get everybody addicted to it, or to define it in a new way.
Yeah, well, yeah, they emphasize one element of it, the erotic element of it, which is only one dimension to it.
You redefine it, you create chaos and confusion, right? Which I would say you fund both sides of the argument,
mm-hmm.
no matter if you or myself included may think one side of the argument is correct.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? But I believe that both sides, whether there's a good or a bad side, I believe that both sides are funded because the purpose was to cause the change anyways, and in order for change to happen, you need opposition. It's reliant upon opposition to make opposition look bad.
Yeah, it's dialectics, yeah.
Yes, so the change is created. The change was the purpose. It was just the fluctuation in and of itself that was the purpose. Once it's been normalized as a kind of confusion, and then you start seeing the results, because what happens is once something that is natural gets redefined and people can't figure out why they're unhappy as a result of the cultural redefinement of something that is normal and natural, they will be inherently unhappy. They're going to have to be distracted to be able to and have multiple versions of why they are unhappy thrown at them to try to supplement the unhappiness, to kind of like distract the unhappiness. Okay, if we can just make these people happy just until they die, then that's okay, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, that gets us back to consumerism, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's also, I've heard Alan Watt say this before. I don't listen to Alan Watt anymore, but when I did listen to Alan Watt, he would talk about this, that one of the things of purpose of psychiatry was it was to get you back into the normal world that was making you crazy to begin with. It's like, hey doc, the world's making me crazy. You say, okay, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you the therapy and the whole bit, and then, are you feeling good? Well, yeah, now I'm feeling better. Okay, good. You're ready to go back into the world that makes you crazy. Which I thought was a great analysis of it. And it's never getting to the root of the problem. It's just, well, yeah, we've got to do things to make you happy because you're obviously unhappy. It's not, no, the world that we live in is all screwed up, and I want to be able to recognize that and try to work through it and try to figure out what it is. It's, no, we need you to do things that make you happy. And I think what happened with a lot of the subjects of Freud's research and Jung's research, I think Jung is a little bit more revealing because he actually appears, I didn't know him personally, but he appears to be a little bit more honest than Freud, is that when you live in a world where people, their one desire in life is to be happy.
Yeah, that's a different philosophical outlook on life, expectation, right? I mean, than the traditional I mean, there was a time when if someone was unhappy, he could fall back on his understanding of literature or philosophy and make sense of it. Whereas people are now, or don't even have that, because they're not even given the proper education to have that. They may work through their problems through an understanding of philosophy or history and putting things in their proper context. Being atomized individuals, completely ignorant of history, completely deracinated, maybe from their culture, they have nothing to fall back on to make sense of what they may be going through. And also they have no sense of normal or morality anymore. So often what they're dealing with is moral pain based on their own behavior, but they can't even access their own moral behavior because they lack what they lack is a firm idea of it's called practical reason, I think, is another term for morality, how to cope with
Mm-hmm.
They don't even have the basis for that anymore.
Well, the other thing is by the time you get up into the early 20th century is you have a redefinition of what happy is. So one thing we've talked about on past calls is food. And one thing I discovered with my research into the normalization of food culture that we now have, and I'm sure you've heard those calls that we did where we talked about all of the bizarre connections of chefs to intelligence agencies.
Mm-hmm.
But another interesting aspect of it is there was a book written lady by the name of Irma Brombacher. She wrote a book called The Joy of Cooking. And one thing I found out in my research that I thought was just mind-blowing.
Everyone had that book. Everyone had that book.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's one of those things. It's like growing up being my age or your age and someone in your family like not owning a Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass album. It's like everybody owned somebody in your family owns a Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass album if you grew up in the 70s.
I do have their greatest hits CD.
Right. Yeah, it's good stuff. I like it.
Yeah.
But everybody owned a copy of The Joy of Cooking. I've got a Joy of Cooking right over here on the on the shelf in the kitchen here, and it's But the most interesting thing I found out about this, like I said, I love these little nuggets that you just find and you're just blown away by this. That was actually the first time ever that the word joy had been applied to cooking, to the idea of cooking.
Yeah.
And so this was a breakthrough as far as like, okay, so now this was something that was, kind of a benign, like we're talking about sex or something like that, kind of this base kind of drive, and people in another time period kind of operated in that fashion where it's like, okay, well, yeah, we eat steak and potatoes and green beans together because those go good together because the steak provides the protein, the potatoes provide the starch, and the beans provide, the green element to it, or a salad or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's got this kind of food group mentality in another time period. Well, The Joy of Cooking comes out, and now it applies this idea that, well, food is something that's going to make you happy.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be but not only just the eating part of it, but the preparing part of it. There's going to be a joy attached to it. Okay? And this is marketing and psychology attached to it. Whether or not there is a joy attached to it or not is not the point. It's that they use this concept to be able to sell the book. And in so doing, created a whole new idea about food in general, to now where the person themselves is consciously aware of the fact that, oh, cooking does make me happy. Oh, eating does make me happy. That's what we do. It's happy, it's good, and it's the same thing like we were referring to earlier. What were we talking about earlier? Where we were talking about this?
As far as
there was something in there was something in particular we had referred to before. In any case, yeah. So, regardless of whether or not something is good or makes you feel good about something, a lot of the things that we have currently that we've lived through, and now in this current day and age that it's the result of, is actually people themselves have gone through generation and generation, passed down ideas of things that they weren't even aware of were created by advertising, and their entire identity and makeup as a person, and then their children's identity and makeup as a person, is through osmosis just created out of lifestyles and fads and ideas that were given to them through the medium of mass culture and advertising.
Yeah. That's the, I get a great example of that, at least for America, is the Henry Luce's Time Life Empire, where all his magazines, whether his, Life magazine, defined what life was supposed to be like in America, what it was, through the pictures. And if you think about how many people looked at Life magazine, it wasn't just the people that subscribed to it, but if you went to a dentist, you looked at Life magazine, and you thumbed through it. And the pictures, remember, it's all imagery. It's all imagery. There's Time magazine, and that was started when Henry Luce went off in World War I and realized that the doughboys knew nothing. They were really ignorant farm boys, and he saw this as a chance to enlighten them or to manipulate them. He started Time magazine, which had Skull and Bones funding to it. He was a Skull and Bones guy. And there was, I think he did Fortune magazine, the idea of American success. It was money, the pecuniary language or philosophy of Fortune magazine. And then there's Sports Illustrated, Breads and Circuses. The Good Life is sports. It's a great diversion to keep you thinking about important things so they can screw you over. And one time a year, what's better about America than girls in bikinis? They get smaller and smaller.
The one thing that most people don't think about sports, because sports is so ingrained into the fabric of life now, is sports at one time was generally relegated to the lower class. Yeah. And I'm not saying anything bad about lower class people. That's not what I'm saying. So don't misunderstand that statement. I'm not saying you, Tim. I'm saying the listening audience. Is sports was relegated to the lower class. Now, bizarrely enough, and this holds true. A lot of the people who you may think of as elitists. A lot of people, think someone like your favorite rap star or your favorite movie star. Yeah, those people are elitists. Okay, if you're a sports star and you're rich, if you're a sports fan and you're rich, you're not. You don't run anything. Okay, because basically what's happened is the sports was relegated to the lower class in America. It was something that, up until about the 1960s, it was something that if you were into it and you were, quote unquote, what they call middle class bourgeoisie or, middle upper class or something, to say you were a kid, especially in college. That's interesting too. That's another part of this Frederick Rudolph book, is the introduction of football to college. That didn't exist until a particular time period. That's another discussion now. But it was something that you shed, with your youth.
Yeah.
it was something that, maybe you played football in high school, maybe you played football in college or something like that, and then that was it. If you did like sports, let's say you like baseball, America's greatest Freemasonic pastime. It was something you did as a child. It was something that that once you got to a certain age, you gave your baseball cards away to somebody or whatever. You gave your glove to your little brother, right? Those type of things. And now, literally, for many generations now, obviously, just out here in Los Angeles, you can't get tickets to a Laker game because you have the front row full of adult adolescents who are some of the richest people in Hollywood.
They just want to be filmed next to Jack Nicholson.
How many years upon years has Jack Nicholson been going to Laker games or or whoever? But and that's what I was saying. You're bringing up Sports Illustrated. Well, Sports Illustrated, interestingly enough, comes at that time period, the late 50s, 60s, and really becomes a powerhouse of bringing sports into the home.
Yeah, it coincides with television, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which changed football, both college and professional football. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a shifting time period. Hey, when I was little, I loved baseball, just just like anybody else. Yeah, and my grandparents had a Sports Illustrated subscription, and it's funny too because kind of the thing that you or myself do with real interesting information. I was already there. I'm sure you were too. Which this proves that the average person is not dumb. Because when I was a kid, I knew who was. I could have told you who was every single guy on the Angels and what he was batting and what position he played, or the Dodgers or any of that type of stuff. Okay, you ask anybody today who is commonly referred to in alternative media, unfortunately, as sheeple or dumbed down masses. I don't really believe that about people, because those people, you ask them, how much money Kobe Bryant made, or how much, how many baskets he scored last year, or whatever, and they know it. They know. When it comes to stats and real trivial nonsense, everybody's really smart.
Yeah, fantasy leagues, things like that, intricate statistics.
Yeah, they've just been misdirected into this area and caring about this type of stuff, and they'll show you how smart they really are and how their brain actually really does function, but they've just been directed into this trivial nonsense. So they are not. So people like that are not dumb.
You get people asking the wrong questions. You don't have to worry about the answer, as someone once said. So, and that's it's to get people asking the wrong questions, because irrelevant questions there. I run into that all the time, and if you're at a get together or a party or whatever, and unless you want to get. If you're in the mood for an argument or something, you hear things said about whether it's current affairs, whether people are completely oblivious to what's really going on in the world just based on what they say. Like, I was at my brother's house over the weekend, and there's something came up about this, the recent shooting at the baseball field by this Bernie Sanders supporter. He shot the whip.
I'm aware of it. I haven't looked too deeply into it, but yeah, I know what you're talking about.
They was talking about it. Like Scalise, I think was the guy who was shot, the congressman, the whip, And it just came up, says, they're talking about the context of left-right politics, and someone says, these assassins are always leftist and communist. And he goes, Lee Harvey Oswald, he shot Kennedy, he was a communist.
Interesting.
I'm like,
yes.
I'm drinking my beer, I just didn't say anything. I wasn't in the mood.
Yes.
I was like, really?
Wow.
Really? Okay, it's a communist. Okay. Yeah, he married that KGB daughter, the KGB daughter of a KGB colonel. So he was able to fly back to the United States, despite the fact that he defected and renounced his U.S. citizenship, without being harassed by the U.S. government. And the CIA had a 201 file on him. He was obviously some sort of an intel operative, whatever it was. He wasn't a communist. But I didn't get into it. I just, because that's just a whole morass. But I'm saying that's just an example of someone's suppositions based on this official narrative. It's like,
right. Yeah, I won't go to one of your parties and tell them my theory about the Kennedy assassination.
Well, I experienced that. I think it was 4th of July. Was it last year? Yeah, last year. Every year we come a family reunion in Ohio, and I have a younger brother who brought up some of the 9/11 stuff, and he's kind of into this thing, and I just came in the middle of a conversation and talking about what was happening. I mentioned some of the problems with the imagery we saw in 9/11, and I boil it down to there is fakery. It's a question to the extent of how much was faked. So what are you talking about? It says, well, I mean, most of us experienced that day through the television set. The vast majority of humanity experienced those events through the television set. That's a medium and subject to manipulation. And there are things on the visuals that cannot be explained based on the understanding of normal physics. And says, I don't know what that means exactly. I have my suspicions. I'm just pointing this out, that this couldn't have happened that way. So what you saw on television was manipulated. And that's my take on it. I said, but it's like, what are you saying? I'm not drawing any conclusions. Draw whatever conclusions you want. Just ask that question. You're just missing what I'm saying because you don't like the implication. Well, that's not logical. Address the question. Planes cutting effortlessly through an airplane, through a 90-ton airplane cutting effortlessly through a 500,000-ton building, reinforced concrete, poking through the other side.
Yeah.
And that was on live television. I remember the guy goes, look, there it is, going through the other side.
Absolutely ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. But it was only through the process of turning this all into people where truth is subjective and truth through manipulation through advertising, that we were able to be sold these life-changing events, and not just like Mr. Jules Henry said there in his book Culture of Man. He says people are not truth seekers. Most people are not truth seekers and don't press to know what truth is.
Yeah, I mean, you and Chris have talked about the alleged moon landings, and that came up. I was on a camping trip, and we were talking about it around the campfire. Again, I never start these conversations.
Me neither.
Yeah, I just don't.
That's actually come up with me on a trip to the mountains too, where somebody's talking about it, and they're, so what do you think of the moon landings? We're in a cabin together in the mountains. It's going to be a weekend. I'm not going to get into this discussion right now.
But I go, at the end of the day, all we have are President Nixon telling us that we did it, the Pentagon telling us that we did it, a ticker tape parade, and some press conferences, and some bad resolution film. None of those are, I would say, are repositories of truth, whether it's the President of the United States, the Pentagon, or NASA, which is really the Pentagon, the CIA, whatever. But I just said, that's in a ticker tape parade. And I mentioned some of the other problems about it, but it said, I'm not saying I know, I'm just asking these questions. Is it reasonable that, that they would lose all the high resolution film or something? Did you really think they played golf on the moon? Come on, and tell me how the rover worked. I want to see that demonstrated. Has it ever been demonstrated in public? Has that thing ever been unfolded and then driven around? I've never seen that happen. And you know, I'm thinking, how'd the plumbing work up there? So
yeah, it was absolutely ridiculous. But you know, I wanted to bring this up here before we've got about 5 minutes left here before I got to get going. There's a book by Julian Huxley. It is called Knowledge, Morality, and Destiny. And there's multiple passages in this book that are just absolutely mind-blowing, to say the least. But I really just discovered this the other day in here, that Mr. Huxley laid out the plan for the current time period when it comes to, you know, the approach to postmodernization of language. And that's kind of a generalization. I think you know what I'm referring to. You know, where anything and everything is anything and everything. A guy with a wig and lipstick on is a woman.
That's right. Language becomes separated from reality. Yeah.
A white woman who says that she's black is black now. You know, she's transracial.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that type of stuff. So we've headed off into the absurdity, the concept of, you know, what you think you are, you then are. It's funny because Mr. Huxley actually talks about this, and he talks about it in a scientific way.
Mm-hmm.
He actually says the essence of science here. I'm going to read these couple of quotes here. Mm-hmm. Concepts are organizations of thought involving generality. And to them, too often, we put assumptions. For instance, the assumption that the immediate separability and temporary persistence of what we call objects or things are absolute, permanent, and essential to them. And by extension, that abstract concepts like goodness or truth are also permanent in absolute essence or qualities. Historically, man appears to have generalized his notions of separateness and persistence before he felt the need to generalize those of wholeness or togetherness in pattern relation, or those of process or orderly change and development. The need for this new mode of organizing our experience is only now becoming fully apparent. We have at last discovered that the reality with which we have to deal with is a hierarchy of pattern processes. We must now learn how to recognize unit processes as we earlier learned to recognize unit objects, to comprehend their characters as we learn to comprehend the properties of objects. In so doing, we shall learn to comprehend the patterns of development which are inherently possible for them, and to make correct assumptions or predictions about their effects. The principle of causality and the formulation of regularities in the shape of scientific laws represent, I suppose, the highest achievements of the analytic and static method. Today we need not abolish them, but to transcend them. This we can do through proper formulation of the principles of relational adjustment and of order in terms of intrinsic modes of forms of development. Okay. The very organization of our language and all our habitual ways of thinking artificially dissociate real and ideal object and subject, quantity and quality, material and spiritual, right or wrong, good and evil, we of the in-group and they of the out-group, individual and society, intuitional appreciation and intellectual analysis. How can we expect people to grow up whole in a world which is presented to them already split by the organization of thought, and when the main instrument we give them in education is one of carving reality into separate slices? It is true that art is a method for putting some of the slices together again, sometimes even for presenting situation as wholes, without preliminary carving up. But it is also true that the entire trend of the modern West has been to regulate art to an inferior position vis-a-vis analytic science. Of course, I do not intend to imply that we should go to the opposite extreme and say that either split personality or social tension is the only symptom or resultant of split thought. Did you hear what he just said right there?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. By the way, LARPing, live action role playing, that is something that people are really into, like having the split personality. Like people have these other personalities that they attribute to themselves.
That
like, would be
it's like moderate form of like method acting or something. Some say.
Yeah, people go and live out these other lives. Also, LARPing is involved with the social justice warrior. It's also involved with the crisis actors, live action role playing.
Yeah.
But a lot of people are into that type of stuff as well, like where they go somewhere and do something, kind of like the cosplay too.
Mm-hmm.
You know what cosplay is, right?
Cosplay? No, I don't.
Oh, costume play where you dress up like.
Okay. Yeah.
You dress up like a Viking and go, pretend to be a Viking or some nonsense. So let me read it again. Of course, I do not intend to imply that we should go to the opposite extreme and say that either split personality or social tension is only the symptom or resultant of split thought. That would be to perpetuate the same basic error after merely turning it upside down. No, we must learn to think in unitary terms. Then we shall see thought as an element in the totality of human life and social transformation, inevitably related to and reacting with other elements in the process, an element whose organization is in part determined by the rest, but which also helps to determine the whole. For unitary thinking, nothing is merely cause or merely effect, nothing solely symptom or solely determinant. Everything is related together in mutual interaction to produce a characteristic pattern or development. The pattern process type of thinking inevitably substitutes the idea of wholeness for anything in the nature of a final goal or static absolute, and that of harmony for ideal perfection. It is perhaps not irrelevant to recall that etymologically the very word health means wholeness.
A lot of thought's been put into sowing all this confusion.
So the interesting thing about this is through a lot of this stuff that we see right now. That's why I tend to not focus on a lot of this, racial division and all that type of stuff, because I know what the end goal is. The end goal is actually unitary thinking. We're seeing that, to break down organization, only to build it back up into a mishmash hive mind of nothingness.
Yeah, the fable of bees, right? Isn't that what Weishaupt wrote about? The fable of bees? He wrote that?
Yes.
Yeah, and that's the hive mentality and tearing down these firewalls in the name of progress or justice or something, and these mediating institutions that we have, whether it's family, church, community, that at some point or another aren't perfect, so they're always subject to criticism and also subject to be manipulated, exploited.
And of course, the interesting part about this, I'm sure you're well aware of, is that Julian Huxley is coined the term transhumanism.
Mm-hmm.
And he basically says in one of his books, I can't remember which one it is, but he says, hey, eugenics is an obsolete term. We got to stop using that. We're going to call it transhumanism now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm paraphrasing. I'm paraphrasing the quote, of course, but that's basically what he says. And so anybody who thinks transhumanism is a good and wonderful thing, it's just basically a cover for eugenics, dysgenics. People get pretty particular nowadays as to how you use the word eugenics, because there's people who think eugenics and all that type of stuff is good. Whatever. I'm just saying the way that he's using the word eugenics and the way that the Cold Springs Harbor people use the word eugenics and the way that Hitler used the word eugenics. Of course, people are going to differ about that now, say that, that's totally unrelated. I don't think so, personally. But the Cold Springs Harbor eugenics and the Hitler eugenics seem the same to me, is what I'm saying.
Well, the funding was even there. The Kaiser Wilhelm Institute was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation.
Right.
Yeah. So,
right. But Hitler was a good guy, Tim. He didn't know that. He was just trying to help. He was just trying to help the German people. Gosh. Anyways, the
Well, this point about language is very important because one thing I sent Chris a headline I thought was very funny a couple of weeks ago. My sister sent it to me. It was a 36-year-old who identifies as 6-year-old crushes home run to win T-ball championship, and. It's just, yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And I was just reading something today. I was going through, and this is the language, just how people lazily fall into this. People who are, I think, are often very good critical thinkers were this whole idea of calling someone who identifies as a female a her is a corruption of the language, because now you're separating language from reality, and that's a leap towards totalitarianism. That's where we get in 1984, where 2 + 2 = 5. Not only do you just say it, you believe it. But I was just
or we say that a Starfire automobile performs like a bat out of hell.
Yeah. Yeah. But I was just reading this, they were talking about Chelsea Manning, former Bradley Manning, changing name to Chelsea Manning. I'm willing to accept the name change, but the synopsis of the interview refers to Chelsea Manning as a her.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
It's he. And
ridiculous.
Is this peer pressure? What is this? I mean,
well, this is the thing. I've emphasized this. Chris has emphasized this before. I don't hate anybody who's gay. I don't hate anybody who calls themselves transgender. It has nothing to do with hate. It just has to do with, let's just be objective. Let's get down to brass tacks here. Just objective reality. Okay? A man who's born a man is a man.
Yeah.
It's not possible for them physiologically to become a woman. Even Gore Vidal talked about this. He was gay.
Mm-hmm.
He was a gay guy. Gore Vidal wrote a book about this. It's called Myra Breckenridge. The subject of the book is 1968 or whatever. It's about a guy named Myron who gets a sex change, and he changes his name to Myra. And one of the premises of the book is he gets a sex change, but he couldn't change the fact that he was a man.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's coming from a gay liberal dude from the 60s who probably was an intelligence asset, I would guess.
Congress of Culture of Freedom, probably, something like that. Yeah. So was Women of Buckley. Women of Buckley.
He was Al Gore's cousin. Did you know that?
Yeah, I know. With Occidental Oil, it's all back to that. Yeah. So, and Hammer and
he had that famous WWF style on-air battle with William Buckley.
Mm-hmm. Staged.
Remember?
Likely.
Yeah.
I'll punch you in the nose. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyways, he wrote that book, and that was one of the premises of the book, is that you can have a sex change, doesn't change the fact that you're a man trapped inside of a female exterior.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the objective reality of the situation. Okay? That's the objective reality of the situation. It's impossible to do. No matter what you change the meanings of words, no matter what you change the perception of society and culture, it just all comes down to the reality that you have a mind of the man, you have a outlook from your view that you're looking out on life is still a man. And it's similar to the fact that objective reality says that planes can't crash into buildings and have the nose cone come out the other side and have the building collapse.
Mm-hmm.
But yet everybody accepts it. So, as we pointed out before, if you live through an absurd reality where a lot of this stuff is absurdist in nature, these absurd things where, oh yes, somebody goes into a gay nightclub and machine guns 50 people to death, allegedly, and he's just got just awesome kill rate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just, Schwarzenegger, Stallone style kill rate here, when most people who never fired a gun can't hit the broadside of a barn door. Everybody knows this if you've shot a gun.
It doesn't help the fact that it turns out to be an actor too, right?
He turns out to be an actor.
Perpetrator.
Anybody who knows anything about firearms knows that the chances of you living from a gunshot wound are very high, as long as it's not directly in the head. But for the most part, you can get shot pretty much anywhere most people live. Of course, in these events, everybody dies. Okay? It's unrealistic. But see, we were fed all of this movie nonsense where, Commando,
mm-hmm.
probably one of the best movies ever made. And I think someone even made a video of that. There's a YouTube video out there where it goes in and shows like Arnold's kill rate.
Oh yeah. The tally goes up and up.
Yeah. So yeah, that's what we're looking at with these ridiculous events. And but so now that we've accepted all of that ridiculousness, why can't you just accept a guy in a wig with lipstick on as a woman, Tim?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You've accepted all of the other nonsense. You might as well accept that too. Okay? And
Mm-hmm.
I've said this before, I'll say it again. The government does not care about you if you're gay. Okay? Just so you know, they don't care about gay people. They don't care about transgender people. They don't care about any of that stuff. They're not going to give you civil rights because they care about you. Ask blacks if civil rights help them out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Have you been to Selma lately?
Yeah, it's a. Everybody should be. I mean, just be aware. You are being used as a political battering ram
mm-hmm.
to alter culture. That's it. Okay, that's it.
Yeah, it was the convenient tool to utilize to violate, to exploit certain fissures in a given community to achieve some other end, whether it was white flight, suburbia, or the destruction of the South as a separate culture or entity, which is currently going on now with this destruction of these memorials and monuments which define the South, and these things. That's another interesting thing. I'm glad you brought that up. I wanted to touch on that really quickly. I really have to get to bed, but yeah, the bringing down of these monuments. It's interesting if you read in that Mystic Chords of Memory book. They actually talk about the erection of monuments as being contrary to Americanism in its first, ideas. Mm-hmm.
Because one of the great quotes in that book is that to paraphrase it, I already put the book back on the shelf, but to paraphrase the quote, it said, "The Greeks made the gods more man-like. America makes men more godlike."
That's great. Go to the Lincoln Memorial. See what he's talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Remember that email that I sent you that one time where I said if you go to the Jefferson Memorial and the Lincoln Memorial, basically what they're trying to tell you in a Zachariah Sitchin type sense is that Lincoln really was 50 feet tall. At one time, that the Jefferson Memorial is a life-size depiction of how big Thomas Jefferson really was.
Yeah, yeah. Why? Yeah. Everyone knows he couldn't be that tall because he couldn't fit into the booth at Ford's Theater if he were that tall. So we know that's not true.
Well, no, that's why the original Ford Theater is gone, because they had to. They didn't tell you that actually it fit people who were 50 feet tall.
Well, it's everyone here is old-fed Abraham Martin.
John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth was also 50 feet tall. He was Anunnaki.
Did he have really white blonde hair?
Yeah. Yeah. Anyways, yeah, but these monuments getting torn down. Personally, I'd say I don't really care either way. Because the interesting thing about it is the Civil War in and of itself that we've been taught about is a complete and total farce. Mm-hmm. It was a Freemasonic agreement. It was a WWF style match here. Not saying people didn't die. I'm just saying that nothing ever happened to Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis. It's well known that both those guys were Freemasons. It's well known that all the other guys on the other side were Freemasons. Well documented that, I've got a book sitting right over there talking about how the Knights of the Golden Circle were all up in the on both sides of the North and the South. Mm-hmm. Of course, Albert Pike is a Civil War general. That's everything else. Anyways,
he's the only Confederate who has a statue in Washington D.C.
Right? Yeah, nobody's going to be trying to tear that. No one's going to try to take that statue down.
Yeah. That's interesting. Why Albert Pike? Morals and Dogma. Albert Pike is a statue in Washington D.C. Wow.
Yeah, I've got a picture in front of that Robert E. Lee one in Charlottesville. And I remember thinking at the time, remember when we went to that park there and saw that statue, and I was laughing. I'm like, I can't believe this is still here. I remember seeing that.
Mm-hmm. And you also have the whole idea of manifest destiny. That wasn't that coming out of August Belmont, and there was the Rothschilds, and it gets into all that, the banking interests and things like that. But obviously, I think that there were real conflicts that I think were like anything. It's a situation where there are real divisions or conflicts that are fissures that can be exploited, and the wars are never fought for the reasons we're told, whether it's slavery or secession, and these are real issues that could have been exploited at the time to achieve some other objective.
There's a great book. There's a great book by Thomas D. Lorenzo called "The Real Lincoln."
Yeah.
That'll hip you to how. That'll give you insight into how Abraham Lincoln really was.
But I guess my other point is you have to study, in order to study political science, you have to start to get into the areas of occult and secret societies. The problem is the political science and historical profession doesn't touch that, and so people.
Here's another good one that you won't see around anymore. Apparently, it used to be something that they actually looked at one time. but it's since been discredited. And it is called The Civil War and Reconstruction by J.G. Randall and David Herbert Donald. And apparently they don't. This book is allegedly a racist book because it doesn't attribute the Civil War to being about slavery. And one of those guys is a Harvard professor. So, but yeah, it's kind of an older book. So,
well, that gets to my point about historiography, how it tends to be shaped around contemporary political issues. For example, the interpretation of the Civil War as being primarily fought over slavery was proffered right around the Civil Rights Movement, 50s and 60s. To serve that contemporary political agenda, that political agenda. The same way that if you look at World War II historiography, how the domination of the alleged Holocaust now dominates World War II historiography, whereas as recently as the 1960s, it was just part of it. And even the war movies themselves, that wasn't emphasized. And now if you watch movies now, it dominates World War II. I mean, the European theater.
Sure.
And so you're dealing with the manipulation. It goes back to where we talk about the mystic chords of memory, and it's got nothing to do with what really happened. A modern interpretation is being proffered to achieve some sort of contemporary political agenda. That mystic chords of memory. That whole. I think Lincoln, it comes out of Lincoln's inaugural address, his first inaugural address, because he has to appeal to the mystic chords of history to fight his war against the South, because he cannot appeal to the Constitution or the law because it's completely illegal. So he has to appeal to the mystic chords of memory, right? This fuzzy. He has to resort to poetry because he doesn't have the law on his side. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because, like I was saying, these monuments that they're going to take down in the name of racism or whatever. Like I said, I don't really care about taking the monuments down. It didn't mean anything to me to begin with, but it's kind of funny to think that by taking down a monument, no matter what it is, that in and of itself is going to erase some sort of pain.
Or solve a problem. I mean, New Orleans has a lot of problems. It's not because there's a Jefferson Davis statue in the city.
Yeah,
politicians
and it's
took the statue down.
It's interesting too that if it were, if it were looked at on the same level, as the people who are saying, we got to take this stuff down because it's racist or whatever. I mean, wouldn't you want to keep it there to kind of be able to point back to it and say, like, hey, this guy here, this guy was the bad guy, or whatever. But one of the things that's interesting about history, especially like what he talks about in Mystic Chords of Memory, is history is moving at a pace that it's not for the person who's not engaging it. It's moving at a pace for people not to be able to comprehend it. And it's like that Jacques Ellul quote, where the man who's taking in the daily news, he doesn't have time to contemplate or think about it. I would extend that just into history in general, just not even the daily stuff, because, like you're saying, for whatever purposes in mass communication, in the field of mass communication, you're only going to be dictated what they want you to know about. So, like you said, the primary purpose of World War II, obviously, is to go fight evil Germans who are gassing Jews, right? and that's it. That's all you're going to remember about it. And it's like the Civil War. The Civil War was obviously to go get, evil white slavery owners or slave owners who needed to be taken down in the North. The North, they never did anything wrong. Obviously,
no, they were all enlightened.
All the upper crust white banking establishment. They were good guys. So,
the New England banks, insurance companies that actually financed the slave trade, that used the proceeds from the slave trade to build their industry to invade the South.
Of course.
Sometimes they're wiping out the Plains Indians.
And I mean it's well documented that the things having to do with the Civil War in and of itself, like I said, I think it was a WWF style match. I think it was fixed, but the purpose of it was to get people into the war, into the idea of it, was to create propaganda against the South, to say that they were all evil white slavery owners. And it's interesting too. It's pretty reflective of current day type situations, where it's like one day, it's like this slavery thing. It's been around for how long, and everybody's cool with it. No big deal. Nobody's thinking about it. Yeah, it's great and wonderful. We've got these slaves. In fact, slaves built the wall on Wall Street in New Amsterdam when New York was called New Amsterdam, and New York was full of black slaves. And then you get to this point where it's like one day, all of a sudden it's like, okay, yeah, that slavery thing's bad now. So we're going to start painting these people in a bad light.
Yeah, you're a decade and a half behind us, therefore you're evil.
Yeah. So, I would liken it to because I worked in the mortgage industry when the financial crisis happened, and I would liken it to this. The broker that I worked for dealt directly with Deutsche Bank, right? Mm-hmm. The day before, Deutsche Bank was accepting loans with floating rates. Everything was cool. You had a floating rate mortgage, it was fine. Two-year fixed rate, and then after the 2 years was up, your rate floated. That was all good. It was good for 10 years. Come to work the next day, what happened? The bank's not accepting 2-year fixed rate mortgages anymore. Right?
Yeah, can you say pump and dump?
Right. So overnight, just out of the blue, if you think about it logically, it makes no sense. Like, wait a minute, but they accepted it yesterday. What changed from yesterday to today? It's like, oh no, yeah, today we don't accept those things that we had accepted for 10 years prior. Right? And so it's always like that when you see these cultural changes where for flux and change and purpose, whether it be political or just cultural change in general, it's like, yeah, that thing that had been happening for 100 years yesterday, yeah, that's bad today.
Yeah.
So, well, in any case, I have to hit the road here, sir.
Yeah, listen, John, thanks for spending so much time. I think we're, almost 2.5 hours.
Yeah, great. I would just like to end it and say, if you like what you hear and you want to check out hoaxbusterscall.com, I do the afternoon commute with Chris Kendall. And if you want to email me, you can find my email address over there. We do accept donations, and I do also have information and sell essential oils. So if anybody's interested in donating or want to hear more about that, you can find my contact information at hoaxbusterscall.com. Like I said, Chris Kendall is the proprietor of that website, so he does a Monday night call as well. And check out what we got going on over there.
Great, yeah. I guess you got a PayPal button there.
Yes, we have a PayPal button. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. You go there, check that out, and listen to the few shows, and if you get something out of it, send a few bucks over there, because this stuff does take a lot of time. It takes resources, and it ain't free. So
and donate to Tim Kelly and our Interesting Times as well while you're at it.
Yes, I'm always accepting donations, just to pay for the bandwidth and the occasional new microphone. So great.
Oh, you have a lot. You have a live. Are you saying you have a live band in the studio?
Yeah.
The band you're with.
Yeah. You got to pay for the microphone, man.
I paid for this microphone.
I pay for this microphone. Tear down this wall.
My Ronald Reagan sounds more like David Rockefeller.
Mao is a great man.
Hey, I paid for this microphone and everything else in New York.
That's pretty good. I like that. New York? That's a good one. Yeah. This is
all right, Mr.
So, okay, I'll let you go. I will probably post this tomorrow, and I will send you the link. And I will wish you good night. I know it's getting late there. It's very late here, so there you go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Take care, John.
You have a good night.
Thanks a lot. Enjoy your summer. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.